Hello, and a very good day to all of you who have joined us. I hope I can see our panelists now. Please feel free to switch on your videos for this CEPS and EconPol Europe lunch debate. We are going to be talking about the Eurozone after the coronavirus pandemic. What are the likely scenarios? Of course, a very timely discussion, and indeed with the Eurogroup meeting happening next week, something very much at front of mind. That's next Thursday on the 11th of June. Now, before I introduce our speakers, let me tell you first a little bit about EconPol Europe, which is a network of 14 institutions across 9 countries. The network's aim is to promote research, scientific research that informs policy and is promoting cross-border cooperation that encourages debate. So events like today are, of course, extremely important to bring together the authors of the research with those people who are making the big policy decisions. This partnership with CEPS for these particular debates will give an even broader audience, because we're always doing this online for this particular series, and we hope that will be a much broader reach. And I can see we have many attendees here. We've got more than 80, and I'm delighted that so many have found time to join us live today for this extremely important topic. So now let me turn to our panelists. I think we have 3 very eminent economists speaking with us today. We have Luigi Bonatti from EconPol Europe, Università di Trento. Luigi, give us a wave, please. There you are. We have Daniel Gros, who is also EconPol Europe, but the director of CEPS, very well known to those of us in Brussels. And a little bit late, but hopefully joining us before the end of our time, we will have Nicola Rossi from the Università degli Studi di Roma. So I will first of all invite Mr. Bonatti to give us your opening remarks. Tell us how your research is looking ahead at the future, and what can we expect from the fallout from this horrible pandemic.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer, for your introduction. And also let me thank Juliet Shaw for her work, a very efficient one, for organizing this webinar. And also let me express my gratitude to CEPS, to EconPol Europe, to IFO for providing us with this opportunity for discussion. And then I'll try to share with you my insights about what's going on in the euro area mainly, and above all about what will be the future implications of what's going on right now. And I'll start just setting down some questions, which will be whether the functioning of the euro area will be irreversibly transformed by the pandemic crisis, and if we'll see the substantive infringement of principles like those preventing the ECB from monetizing public deficit, or the euro area members from mutualizing their debt, or the EA, the euro area, from becoming a transfer union. That would be the questions. And then if these infringements are necessary and sufficient to avoid the Eurozone implosion, and if they will be temporary or permanent or long-lasting at least. And finally, if there will be enough political consensus in both the so-called core countries and in the periphery for this policy shift. Of course, I won't have time enough for trying to address all these questions, so I'll try just to give you some ideas, some insights again. So my perspective will be a little bit Italo-centric, but it's not only because this is my vantage point, in a way, I'm in Italy, but also because I think that Italy's situation is playing quite a big role in this phase. And the reasons are perhaps obvious because, first of all, the stock of the Italian government debt is so large, to 0.5 trillion euro, which will be enough Italian debt crisis to destabilize or at least having very serious effects for the entire EA. And you know that Italy GDP per capita is stagnating since a quarter of a century now, no growth in Italy, no productivity growth, which makes the Italian situation very vulnerable to any kind of shocks. And you can imagine this, such a large shock, what long-term implications can have for an economy like that. And then because, and this is relatively new, now in Italy, you have also quite high political risks that are primarily associated with the majoritarian support enjoyed by the three, let's call them populist parties. This consent now has stabilized around 55% of voters, although with some reshuffling about them. And the attitudes of these parties towards Europe range from open hostility or also anti-euro rhetorics to the declared intention to be very aggressive and also to try to use a possible threat of Italexit as a negotiation negotiation tip towards the other partners. So let me say that I think this had some influence on Mrs. Merkel turnaround. I'm talking about turnaround because after a long opposition, at least in principle, to the possibility of grants or transfers within the euro area or mutualization of debt in a way or in another. As you know, with the proposal together with Macron, things have changed quite a lot under this respect. So I was asking myself what kind of considerations might have been important for Merkel to change her mind. And so I think, by the way, the decision, the ruling of the German Constitutional Court of May 5th also may have played some role because of that ruling, it appeared clear that the ECB could not go forever buying large amounts of Italian debt in particular, so that fiscal policy had to play some role in order to avoid a possible Italian default. And I think in this probably also the acceleration of the so-called deglobalization probably played a role because because of this, it becomes probably more valuable for Germany to preserve the EA, the euro area, as its economic bloc, even at the cost of investing resources for avoiding the implosion of its weaker partners. And also, again, geopolitical risk probably is an additional motive. again, if you look at the international links that Italian populist parties have with Putin's Russia, in particular Salvini's League, and with the Trump administration, the brothers of Italy, of Ms. Meloni, or with China, the Five Stars, you may see that probably this risk of having Italy becoming a sort of Trojan horse for hostile powers and inserting another element of destabilization in the European Union, it might have been an important consideration, but of course there are costs and risks connected to this turnaround. For instance, the split with traditional allies, such as the so-called Frugal Four, and this is a political cost, since probably the latter, the Frugal Four, being small, can, in a way, free ride on the German efforts to rescue the weakest members of the euro area. And then another risk is the increase and more direct exposure to a possible Italian default or Italexit. And this also means that there is more risk that future Italian governments may utilize this increased exposure as a lever for future negotiations over additional grants, possible bailouts, or loans. And again, this are probably something that has been considered, but in a global and overall assessment, this may be considered price that cost could be paid in order at the moment to safeguard the integrity of the Eurozone. And finally, let me say something about Italy. So these emergency funds probably are not game changers for Italy, but are precious for buying time. No doubt about this, because grants represent a relief, even if then a large part of it have to be repaid, but starting from 2028, so Italy will have some time, and then also all the loans can mean that the cost of financing of these loans is supposed to be lower, of course, than the cost, the interest that Italy has to pay on its own bonds. So even if then this debt to European institutions is senior, I think that overall that will be represent considerable savings for Italy, and this will reduce somehow market pressure and also the dependence on the ECB, and also this again will probably weaken the Italian populist parties, at least in the short term. And finally, we may think that Italy will have more political leverages in case of debt restructuring, because now EU institutions are quite involved, even more than they were used to be. And just a very final remark on this. Those who are following the Italian situation knows that the demand for the ESM loan is very hotly debated issue in Italy. It's a sort of taboo for Italian populists. They associate the ESM to the Troika, to the Greece crisis. And so exactly because of this, if requesting such a credit line for health-related expenses by Italy would be particularly significant from a political point of view, since it would signal to investors that political risk has been in a certain way reduced in Italy. Okay, I think I already.
Thank you. I think you did, yes. Well, you covered a lot of ground, and we do appear to be one man down, unfortunately. I would also say at this point, I noticed some of you have already started using the Q&A function, which is great. That's at the bottom of the screen for participants if they want to ask a question. Martin Schwett has already asked one there. We'll come to that after we hear Daniel's opening remarks. Over to you, Daniel.
I must say I'm quite optimistic. I think this is a good crisis for Europe. After initial some stumbling, now the outlook is quite good. And let me emphasize perhaps two things. At the initial crisis, at the initial stages of the crisis, uncertainty reigns and financial markets get nervous. And the key catchword is liquidity. Right? Can I survive until tomorrow? Can I pay my bills tomorrow? And here, the European Central Bank, like all central banks in the world, has reacted very strongly. And that's the one lesson they learned from the past. If there is a panic in the market, you have just to give it liquidity. And liquidity is something the central bank can create at will and without limits. And that has been done. So I think the liquidity crisis is behind us. Market participants now know the world will not end tomorrow. It might be tough, but actually we already see some end of the tunnel. And the second prong of the public reaction was fiscal policy. And here again, initially, of course, governments just didn't know how much would be needed, and perhaps they don't even know, even now do not know exactly, but they have made up their mind that now is not the time to be timid. So they are spending like there is no tomorrow, even the German government. And that, of course, this fiscal policy aspect always brings up the problem in Europe, which is that compared to the United States or Japan, individual governments don't have the central bank which backs them up. So they have to look at what their fiscal space is. And that's why initially there were big concerns whether countries like Italy or Spain could actually also provide enough fiscal support for their economies. And the answer is, I think, yes, they can. They don't need actually liquidity from the ESM from others. And the explanation is very simple. Governments spend a lot, but people, households, spend very little. They didn't have occasion to. So there is an endless supply of savings, and governments just mop that up. And therefore, I don't see a big problem on this front either. Now we come to the point where Europe initially stumbled, namely that there was no expression of European solidarity. And that, of course, was linked to the initial German refusal to have any kind of European liabilities, joint liabilities. And here, Germany under Merkel has changed its position. in a limited way, in a way which limits the risk to Germany and the rest of the creditor countries, because there will be, quote unquote, only either 500 billion or 750 billion, depending on the outcomes of negotiations, of European bonds, which will be bonds of the European Union. They will not be specially guaranteed by Germany, except for the German part of the budget. And as Luigi also said, Italy also guarantees its part to the budget. But this is, I think, very important symbolic step. And I think it has done much to also reassure investors that, yes, Europe exists. Its contribution to the fiscal effort will be minor, but not negligible. And so I think everything has been prepared basically for a reasonable European response. We don't know yet how the economy will perform, V-shaped recovery, U-shaped, that we cannot know now. It will be, and we will know that in the course of the next months. But we know that we have the ECB, which is willing to do, quote unquote, whatever it takes, and national governments do the same, and there's a strong European element. I don't think one can ask for much more in this uncertain environment. And now I think basically we have to implement at the European level what France and Germany have made possible. We have to bring on board, somebody mentioned already, the Austrians and the others, but my presumption is that will be done. And then basically we have to sit and wait how the economy evolves, how it recovers, and hoping that we can keep the disease under control, which seems to be the case for the time being. And therefore, I would say, I'm usually very critical, but I don't see many big mistakes which have been made or which still need to be corrected.
Okay, well, I think your opening remark, it's a good crisis for Europe, is a strong point that's going to flutter some feathers, I think. I mean, and of course, in regards to the ECB, we are going to see Christine Lagarde in front of the European Parliament's Economy and Monetary Affairs Committee on Monday. So I think we'll all watch that quite closely to see what she says. Turning to some of the questions, there was one here regarding Italy and the possibility of defaults by Italy. Luigi, is that something that may be used as leverage by Italians?
You mean this? I think would be a question for the future. At least in terms of statements, in recent weeks we heard more than once leaders of the populist parties just openly declared that Italy should have put its possible default on the table as a mean to make pressure on our partners to have more grants and more aid. So especially these quite aggressive leaders of these populist parties could exploit this anti-Europe sentiment, which, as you may know, is at the moment quite widespread in Italy. We see now if with the recovery fund, with the additional intervention of the ECB, this sentiment will change. Of course, this is quite crucial. But in any case, this is a possibility, of course, that in the future, especially if the Salvini's and Meloni parties will win next election, that's a very concrete possibility. We may see them using this threat as a bargaining threat. And don't remember also, I don't want now to give you a too pessimistic picture of the scenario, but don't forget that there is a fringe of the especially of the Salvini's party, which is at the moment the majoritarian party, 27% in polls of possible votes, that are openly in favor of an Italy exit. And they have an influence. So don't forget this.
Absolutely, and I think that actually feeds in quite clearly to another question we have just had in, which is, don't you see a risk that European peoples identify authoritarian governments and solutions as better to face the globalization risks, this sort of this closing of the doors? Daniel, what's your reaction to that?
I would say the opposite. At least it depends on which country you're talking about. In Germany, for example, there's a widespread feeling that the German brand of democracy and of federalized democracy, not in the American sense, but in the European sense of having regions which are very important. People are quite satisfied with that, and I don't see any desire or stronger movement towards having a strong man. I think France is actually similar. Macron actually hasn't come out very much as a strong man, and his plans apparently are now to decentralize. And in Spain, the attempt of the prime minister to somehow have more power centralized actually failed. So I don't see that. Let me perhaps comment on one thing which on your question earlier. The leverage Italy has in terms of its debt. I think with this concession by Merkel, once this fund is up and running, the leverage of Italy will diminish very strongly. Because the reaction from the rest of Europe will be, we have helped you. If you now come and say you just use the threat of a default against us, many thanks, bye-bye. And there Italy will be very much alone. So I think actually this leverage will diminish. And I think future Italian leaders will experience that firsthand. What comes back, one has to come back always to this dog that doesn't bark, namely Spain and Portugal. They could have been in a much worse situation than Italy. They could have threatened also, but they don't do that. In that sense, I think Italy is isolating itself as the odd man out, the country which attributes all its failures to Europe. And I think this is a strategy which might work domestically. But at the European level, I think once the acute crisis is over, this strategy will backfire.
Luigi, did you want to react to that, or shall we move on to some of our other questions?
No, I may only add to what Daniel said, that I agree, let's say ex ante, namely right now we may say that if in 2 years from now, let's say, Italy will still have big problems in dealing with its own debt, and it will ask for having more grants to the other EU countries. Right now, we may say, yes, at that point, the partners will tell Italy, okay, we gave you a lot of money, and that's enough. Now the emergency, the pandemic is over. But when supposedly in 2 years from now, Italy will be again in big troubles, again the dilemma which is right now faced by the other partners will be again on the table, and the reasons for which right now then Germany in particular decided to change its own position probably will be again quite significant, these reasons. So the questions will be very, I think, again. So, but we are speculating about the future that, of course, by definition, nobody can know exactly. But I have to say that my considerations are motivated also by the fact that I'm not totally sure that Italy will use these funds in a proper way, let's say, and that in 1 or 2 years from now, I think there are some relatively high probability that still will have big troubles in dealing with our debt.
Okay, Daniel, I think you were going to ask a follow-up question regarding Italy's legacy debt.
Yeah, I think the legacy is a problem. It will not go away. And I think Italy actually should have little problems dealing with it, given the low interest rates and given the abundance of domestic savings. We have seen the very big success with this domestic debt offering, which they did, a couple of domestic bond offering, which they did, I think, last week or a couple of weeks ago. So I don't understand all these concerns about the financing, of course, if you have a government coming in which says, oh, maybe we don't repay our debt, then all hell breaks loose. But imagine you have a right-wing government coming in, which somebody who says, I want to have a strong country. And the first thing they have to do is to ask Europe for money because they have destroyed the confidence. It doesn't seem to me winning a political strategy. So I think this is really very much overplayed. With this European fund, Italy will get some money. It might not use it very well, and there I agree with Luigi. But after that, Europe can say, that's it, guys, you're on your own.
Okay, well, speaking of strongmen leaders, we have a question from Andrzej Huska regarding Hungarian Prime Minister, as well as the Czechs have been very critical and floated the possibility of a veto. Now, if they don't do it, probably won't do it, but if it was to happen, what would be your expectations? Would there be a package just for the Eurozone? How do you see that playing out in a hypothetical way? Daniel, I'll let you answer that first, and Luigi, I'll come back to you.
I don't know, for me, it's too far away. These guys have never been really strong on principles. A billion here, a billion there. And also, we shouldn't forget that the Commission, in my view, made a big mistake just a couple of weeks, already months ago, when they basically liberated the entire remaining funds from the MFF, right? The stuff which hasn't been spent yet. And this was, I think, several billions for Hungary, for the Czech Republic, for Poland. So I think these countries and their leaders have always been very strong domestically, and then they come to the European Council, and as long as they get their billions, they don't say anything. Sorry to be a bit cynic, but I regard this as really extremely unlikely. By the way, if they veto it, then there's no MFF and no money for them.
Okay. Luigi, do you see anything in this hypothetical situation of possible vetoes?
I agree on this. I completely agree with Daniel. I don't see. And by the way, if you see the figures of the van der Leyen Commission proposed allocation of the recovery fund, Hungary is doing very well in percentage of its own GDP, by the way. So I don't see Orban renouncing to that money. Probably he will try to have something more, but no veto, I don't think it's a possibility.
Okay, well, we have another question directly for you from Fabian Krutzer, asking, what would be your suggestion to the EU, the stronger countries to help the weaker ones, keeping moral hazard in mind? And, you know, he notes that you have already mentioned the supervision possibility. It's quite a broad, I think, quite a general advice question. I think possibly you've already answered it. Do you want to have another go, Luigi?
So if I got it, the question is on the moral hazard associated to this money coming. And of course, there is a moral hazard problem, no doubt. But this is almost impossible to avoid the moral hazard problem when you give when you give money to countries. But you know, perhaps a careful monitoring on the European Commission about the use of these funds can be partially, at least, a response to the moral hazard concern, but again, only partially. Then the problem, in particular with Italy, we have seen that the moral hazard problem in the past years was a very much serious concern, because Italy exploited the so-called fiscal flexibility of the European Commission in past years for getting more fiscal space, but the use that that he did of this money was not so much for financing structural reforms or boosting the growth potential of the country. You know, that this money was used, for instance, for resuming early retirement or giving money as an assistant measure, more or less to a large part of the to promising assistance. So was not exactly the use that Italy was supposed to do for trying to making its economy stronger, you know. So the moral hazard problem is there, and it's possible to avoid.
Okay, thank you. Now we've had quite a few questions on Italy, so we'll move on for a moment because I'm conscious that we only have about 20 minutes left. There's quite a long question here from a Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous attendee on the European economic outlook. So the person is interested in the panelists' opinions on the unprecedented diversion between the current European economic outlook, challenged for the foreseeable future, and the pricing of risk assets, whose prices seem to be increasingly determined by central bank actions. What are the limits to the ECB policy and their balance sheet? And do you ever see the ECB balance sheet shrinking again in our lifetime? Daniel.
Thanks. I think one can understand the pricing of so-called risky assets if one takes into account that when you price these assets, you think about how much cash flow can they give you, not tomorrow, but over the next 20 years. And if this crisis overcome in 1 or 2 years, okay, we'll have 1 or 2 years which are bad, and 18 years which should be hopefully normal, right? So the impact of the crisis could be actually understood in that the limited impact would be understood in this way. I know everybody says that the central banks are flooding markets with money, this drives up asset prices. I disagree with this view. I think it's just much too simplistic. It is especially not true for Italian government debt, because it's not the ECB which is buying, it is the Banca d'Italia which is buying on its own account, meaning there should be zero impact on Italian government debt. That's an economic point which people don't get into their head. They just look at the central bank balance sheets. They say, oh God, they're big. Therefore, asset prices must go up. As I said, I disagree with this view. I think one can explain asset prices also through their longer-term view. And therefore, I'm not so surprised that they're going up, because things are slowly getting back into shape.
Luigi, do you agree this pricing of risk assets, and again, this looking to the future, do you think we will ever see the ECB balance sheet shrink again?
My bet, my easy answer is never. So I think it's irreversible, this increase of the central banks. I'm not talking only about the European Central Bank, but more in general about all the main central banks. So I don't see the possibility that the debt, the asset that they have accumulated will be a day or another day will be sold, or their I mean their balance start being reduced. I don't see as a serious possibility in the next, in the predictable future at least.
Okay, then.
By the way, this also says something. This is why, you know, sometimes there is this request of the ECB to monetize the public debt of countries more in trouble. But this is already happened to a large extent, and this will happen more and more in the next years. And again, it cannot publicly declare that it's doing this, but de facto, and as markets look at the issue, I think everybody knows that this asset will be at this point out of the market forever.
Okay, I'll turn now to a question that came in quite early on, but we haven't had a chance to tackle, which is, to what degree does this crisis make industrial planning policies more legitimate? Daniel, I'll let you tackle that first.
Oh, it will make it more legitimate in the eyes of politicians and the public, but I think it will be pretty useless. Because if you have a pretty predictable situation, then it makes sense perhaps for the government to say, here are certain sectors that we want to help. But if you have a situation where things are really unpredictable, I doubt very much that the government has the best knowledge to pick the future winners. And the pressure to just help old industries to survive is particularly strong now, because the old industry will say, this is not justified. Just because of Corona, all these jobs should be lost. And therefore, I think it is a very dangerous moment to switch to a more active industrial policy.
I mean, as a follow-up question, I mean, does that mean you think that sort of innovation is going to be sacrificed on the altar of COVID-19 recovery?
De facto, I think yes.
Okay, Luigi, then your take on this. It's industrial planning policies. Daniel's quite skeptical there. Do you think they will help? Will they be more legitimate or less legitimate?
I have to agree with Daniel again on this. And unfortunately, one of the reasons for which I'm not so optimistic about the use that Italy will do of these funds is exactly that right now in Italy there is a lot of talking about going back to having the state intervening, having a big part on the industrial policy and in the recovery. But I'm afraid that this will turn out to be a way of having a generalized bailout of zombie firms. You know, even the paradigmatic case in Italy is with our Alitalia company, which again now the government is claiming that it will put at least 3 billion of these funds for rescuing again Alitalia, which is a hopeless enterprise, I think. But this is only an example. So we'll have quite a big pressure. And then also there is a change in culture going on. So there are a lot of people and also economists saying now that the pandemic, or more in general, the last 20 years show that the so-called neoliberal kind of globalization has failed. So now states have to be much more present in the economy and having also a policy for innovation, trying to select the future winners. So I'm quite afraid that this will be the trend in next years, and again, in particular, in Italy.
Well, since we are back to Italy again, I think you've partially answered a question there from Marco Lopeore, who is wanting your assessment on the structural reforms needed in Italy to make GDP grow again. So, I mean, do you think some of these things you've suggested or these problems you've highlighted would have a positive impact on GDP if rectified?
I think most of these reforms are quite well known, because now are years that are discussed and suggested by experts, by the IMF, by the OECD, by the European Commission. And so the problem is not so much to know what has to be done in Italy. The problem is that probably we don't have the conditions in terms of political consent and also public opinion consent for doing those reforms. So what reforms I'm talking about? For instance, let's say that tax reform is needed, but which does not mean, unfortunately, a reduction of average tax pressure in Italy. I don't see the room for this in the next years, while the debate in Italy is exactly on this, of how much tax reduction we have thanks to these European funds in the next years, while the problem is shifting taxation from productive factors, from labor and enterprise, to rents, to properties, and trying to reduce, which is absolutely possible in principle, trying to reduce a large tax evasion area. And another issue is a labor market. It's I think unsustainable to have a situation in which you have extremely high unemployment and extremely low participation to the labor market in certain areas of Italy, such as the south, and a totally different situation in other parts of the countries, and big differential in productivity, but at the same time, you have the same national contracts all over the country, even if everybody knows that the cost of living is at least 1/3 lower than in the south than in the north. This is unfair, inefficient, but again, is a political taboo. You can not even touch this issue. It's not on the table. But I don't see how the South, which is 1/3 of the Italian population, can be resume some sustainable growth without facing and addressing these kind of issues. But I don't see there is any chance in that. And probably, by the way, talking about, again, moral hazard, having all this money coming from this point of view will not make things easier, because you can go on right now, also thanks to these funds, without addressing these structural issues. So there is not pressure for making these reforms right now.
Thank you. And okay, we have another question, once again, on sustainability of Italian government debt, once PEP and the other monetary policy mechanisms are over. Daniel, I'm going to give you a choice of whether you want to answer that question, because we really have laboured a lot of the points regarding Italy, or whether you want to take another question regarding the frugal four, because I am conscious that we've only 5 minutes left, and I want to give you a couple of minutes both to wrap up. So, Daniel, do you want to talk more about Italy, or perhaps then touch on why Sweden remains stuck to the frugal four position?
I have no particular insight in the Swedish position. It's for them an important principle. I remember Finland, for example, taking a very tough position on Greece and wanting to have some guarantees. But in the end, I think a compromise will be found. In all the frugal four, they cannot really say that this is for them a life or death, political life or death decision, because nothing has to be paid for the next 7-8 years. So, right, the Swedish finance minister cannot say, I cannot go to my parliament because, no, there's no additional expenditure. So I think this is to be taken con grano salis. And on the debt service of Italy, I always say there's enough domestic savings in Italy to pay off all that. And if the Italians keep the faith in their own government, there's no problem.
Okay, well, that's a sort of good point. I'm going to ask you both to give me your wrap-up thoughts, and particularly with a crystal ball in mind, looking to the future. Give me predictions for a timeline for us coming out of the crisis. When do we see the so-called new normal? When will things stabilize? In your view, given sort of different scenarios. So Luigi, you first, perhaps. What's your crystal ball? What does the future hold? And give us some sort of time frames.
So just speculating on the future, these are pure speculation. I'm wondering, together with others, if there is any chance to have a sort of stagflation again, as in we had in the after the oil shocks in the 70s. In the aftermath of the crisis, of course, we don't see any sign of inflation at least in 1 year. But when people will again resume some spending, I think there is some chance to see some sort of stagflation, because the disruption of the so-called value-added international chains will play a role. The reshoring of production will play a role on this. And then, because there will be additional production costs also due to the health measures that have to be taken for reducing the risk of the epidemics, which will probably add to the cost of production. And this will be, I think, quite a serious worry to see some sort of stagflation, because this will put also central banks in a very difficult situation. And for heavily indebted countries, this may be a serious problem. And also, finally, I want to say that it will be very important, the synchronism of recovery. If you have countries which are still in the pandemic depression, while other, I'm talking now about Europe, and other countries which are still on recovery. This again will be quite a problem, especially for the European Central Bank. But you know, now it's really difficult to predict.
I know, it was a tough question to give you right at the end. But Daniel, can you have a stab at answering it as well?
I mean, the rest of this year looks pretty uncertain, and maybe an uncertain recovery because you still don't know will there be a second wave or so. I would expect that there will be no real second wave. There might be continuing small hurts, so to speak, which small problems which arise, but will probably be locally circumscribed. Next year should be a recovery. Strong. How strong enough to overcome the whole we have to get out of? That I don't know. But I think that's the point when important decisions will be made. Will we try just to keep all the old structures? Or do we say we use this recovery also to change some structures? Do we wean the economy from the extraordinary fiscal and monetary support which we have given this year? And I think this will be the big discussion next year. But the background to that discussion should be strong growth from a very low level.
Okay, thank you. That's a relatively optimistic outlook. Let me say thank you very much once again to both of my panelists. Thank you to all the attendees who have been joining online and those of you especially who submitted questions, which I hope we did our best to answer for you. Of course, although the webinar is now over, you can continue the conversation over on Twitter. Remember to follow EconPol Europe and CEPS_think tank. And with that, I'll thank you all. And unfortunately, we didn't have Nicola, but I believe there were some problems there. So thank you once again to everyone who attended and to our panelists. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.